In the Wind River Range of 1888, winter was not a season, it was a siege. For the company of trappers holed up in a high-altitude rendezvous cabin, it was a daily battle measured in stacked cords of wood and dwindling tins of coffee. The men who worked these lines, men like Jedediah Franks, were creatures of proven tradition. They relied on tools that had been tested by a generation of hard-earned survival. Heavy buffalo coats, snowshoes of ash and rawhide, and rifles that spoke with authority. Jed's own rifle was a point of pride. A custom Sharps, 1874 in 50-90. A buffalo gun that fired a lead slug the size of a man's thumb. It was a tool of brutal, close-range certainty. Then there was Silas Vane. Vane was an outsider, a quiet man of German extraction who seemed to treat the wilderness not as an adversary to be beaten, but as a problem to be solved. And his solution, it seemed, was insanity. While Jed and the others huddled by the fire, their heavy-barreled cannons leaning against the wall, Vane would be outside in the wind, his rifle resting on a log. It was a preposterously delicate-looking thing. It lacked the massive, reassuring octagon barrel of the Sharps. Its stock was slender, and most unnerving of all was the long, polished brass tube mounted on top. A telescope. The trappers, when Vane was out of earshot, called it the spyglass rifle, or more simply, Vane's folly. They had seen him spend hours at the reloading bench, not just pouring powder and seating a bullet, but measuring powder grains on a tiny jeweler's scale, using strange metal tools to resize his brass, and scribbling numbers in a small, leather-bound notebook. Jed Franks had watched him one afternoon, squinting through the contraption in the falling light, and declared, "A man needs iron sights. That glass'll fog in the damp or shatter in the cold. It's a toy." As the blizzard closed in, as the temperatures dropped to 20 below zero and the wind began to howl, Vane's rifle seemed the very definition of fragile, complex failure. His folly was a laughingstock. But in 72 hours, that toy would be the only thing standing between the entire party and a violent, starving death. What did this quiet German gunsmith understand about killing power that a generation of seasoned American frontiersmen had fundamentally misunderstood? The year was 1888. The great buffalo herds were gone, and the West was changing. The doctrine of the frontier rifle, however, was not. It was a doctrine written in heavy lead and black powder. The manuals, the gunsmiths in St. Louis, and the veterans of the plains all agreed. Survival in hostile territory against man or beast required mass. The standard was the 45-70 government cartridge, or for the true frontiersman, something even heavier, like the 50-90 or the 50-110. These cartridges were designed to fire a massive, slow-moving piece of soft lead, often weighing 500 to 700 grains. The philosophy was simple. A big bullet makes a big hole, and a big hole stops a big animal fast. The trajectory was a secondary concern. Most encounters were expected to be inside 150 yards. A man learned to lobby his shots, to estimate the dramatic rainbow arc of the bullet as it flew. The sights were part of this philosophy. A standard rifle came with a buckhorn rear sight, a simple V-notch and a front blade. For long-range work, a man might invest in a tang-mounted peep sight, but this was for target shooters. The real frontiersman, the culture dictated, was a snap shooter who pointed his rifle as he would his finger, trusting instinct and the sheer, devastating power of the cartridge to do the work. Telescopic sights existed, but they were viewed with profound suspicion. They were expensive, costing as much as the rifle itself. They were known to be fragile, their delicate lenses and mounting systems unable to withstand the recoil of a 50-90 or the rough handling of a life lived on horseback. The consensus was clear. A telescopic sight was a plainsman's nightmare. It would fog, it would break, it would lose its zero at the worst possible moment. The book demanded simplicity, reliability, and overwhelming close-range force. Silas Vane's rifle, with its light barrel, its small caliber bullets, and its fragile glass, violated every single one of these proven rules. Jedediah Franks was the living embodiment of this conventional wisdom. His rifle was a masterpiece of the old school. It was an 1874 Sharps long-range model, weighing 14 pounds, with a 34-inch heavy octagon barrel. The wood was oiled walnut, the receiver case hardened. He had paid $80 for it, the equivalent of half a year's wages. He fed it 50 cartridges, each one loaded with 90 grains of black powder, pushing a 600-grain paper-patched lead bullet. The recoil was staggering. It kicked like a mule and hit like a train. But its limitations were becoming painfully clear in the high, thin air of the Rockies. One afternoon, with a light 15-mile-per-hour crosswind, Jed had spotted a magnificent bull elk 250 yards across a small meadow. He was a good shot. He lay down, carefully estimated the wind, held his front sight 3 feet high and a foot into the wind, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle boomed, obscuring his vision in a cloud of white smoke. When it cleared, the elk was gone. The bullet, pushed by the wind and dropping fast, had impacted the snow yards from the target. This was the practical failure of the heavy lead philosophy. The massive, slow-moving bullets, traveling at only 1/200 to 1/300 feet per second, were disastrously affected by gravity and wind. A slight misjudgment in range, or a sudden gust, meant a clean miss. In the extreme cold, the black powder itself became a problem. After 2 or 3 shots, the fouling or residue in the barrel would build up, absorbing moisture from the air and freezing solid, making reloading difficult and destroying accuracy. The ammunition was immensely heavy. A belt of 20 cartridges weighed nearly 3 pounds. Jed Franks had the most powerful rifle in the territory, but he was spending more time cursing the wind and cleaning his bore than he was bringing in pelts. He blamed the conditions, the powder, the bad light. He never blamed the rifle. Silas Vane had not come to America to trap beaver. He had come because the mountains of Wyoming reminded him of his home in the Swiss Jura, only magnified 1,000 times. He was born in Solothurn, a city not of frontiersmen, but of watchmakers and armorers. His apprenticeship had not been in skinning animals, but in lapping gear trains, tempering mainsprings and grinding lenses for chronometers. He understood metallurgy at a level the American blacksmiths, with their brute force forges, could not comprehend. He had worked on the early Vetterli military rifles, seeing firsthand the new ideas coming out of Europe. Repeating actions, metallic cartridges, and the new, dangerous, smokeless powder that burned with almost no residue and produced velocities that seemed impossible. He viewed a rifle not as a club, but as a scientific instrument. When he arrived in Wyoming, he was fascinated. He observed the Shoshone, learning how they moved without sound, how they read the wind, and how they possessed a patience he, as a European, had to learn. But he also saw their tools, traded single-shot Springfields, and saw their limitations. He watched the white trappers, like Jed, and was appalled by their imprecision. They were trying to solve a problem of physics with brute force. He brought with him a knowledge of applied mathematics, of internal ballistics, and of optics. He knew that the future was not in a heavier bullet, but in a faster one. When he began to assemble his rifle, the mockery was immediate. He used tools the others had never seen, micrometers, borescopes, and tiny, precise files. They saw his delicate work, his light touch, and his constant note-taking as weakness, the fiddling of a man unsuited for the raw, hard land. They called him clockmaker behind his back. Vane's prototype began not with a pile of parts, but with a theory. The theory was that precision could replace mass. He started with a falling block action. The Winchester 1885 high wall, known for its strength and simplicity. This the other trappers understood. But then the madness began. He did not buy a barrel, he made one. He ordered a steel blank from a mill in Pennsylvania and spent 3 weeks in the small, dark smithy at the rendezvous, patiently boring and rifling it. The other men heard the strange, rhythmic sound of his hand-powered rifling machine, a meticulous, slow process. The caliber was his own creation, a Wildcat cartridge. He took the common .40-65 case and necked it down, or squeezed the neck of the brass, to accept a much smaller .30 caliber bullet. He was firing a 180-grain pointed projectile, which he cast himself from a hard lead-tin alloy. To push it, he used a small, carefully measured charge of the new, distrusted, smokeless powder. But the centerpiece was the scope. It was 3 feet long, built from a brass tube he had intended for a high-powered telescope. He had ground the lenses himself from optical glass blanks he had shipped from Germany, a process that took 2 months of painstaking, mind-numbing polishing. He mounted it to the rifle using a set of steel blocks he had machined by hand. These mounts were the true genius. They were micro-adjustable for windage and elevation, using fine-pitched screws. To the other trappers, it was a monstrosity. "That thing's longer than the damn barrel, Vane," Jed had laughed. "What happens when the snow gets in your spyglass? Or when you slip and that thing hits a rock?" Vane simply nodded, finished his adjustments, and continued his silent calculations. The conflict was one of fundamental physics, a head-on collision between 2 warring philosophies. Jed Frank's philosophy was overwhelming force. He believed the wilderness was a blunt, powerful enemy, and it must be met with equal force. His 600-grain bullet was a fist. It didn't need to be precise, it just needed to arrive. Its sheer kinetic energy, he argued, would knock a bear off its feet, even with a poor hit. He was a believer in knockdown power, a concept that relied on sheer momentum. He was solving the problem by maximizing the mass part of the kinetic energy equation. He was willing to accept the consequences. A trajectory that arced like a mortar, a rifle that weighed a ton, and a punishing recoil. Silas Vane's philosophy was surgical efficiency. He had read the German ballistic studies. He knew that knockdown power was a myth. What killed was not a punch, but a hole, specifically a hole in the right place. He knew that the slow, 600-grain lead bullet, for all its mass, was soft. It would often pancake us to flatten on a thick hide or a heavy bone, failing to penetrate to the vital organs. Vane's system was designed for one thing: penetration. His smaller 180-grain bullet, cast from a hard alloy and traveling at over 400 feet per second, twice the speed of Jed's bullet, had incredible sectional density. It was long and thin for its weight. It would not flatten. It would fly, as he put it, like a steel needle, resisting wind far better than Jed's flying brick and penetrating deeper into the animal, shattering bone and destroying organs. He was solving the problem by maximizing velocity. His rifle was an instrument for delivering a precise, fatal wound from a distance. Jed wanted to bludgeon the target. Silas intended to shoot through it. The first validation of Vane's system came not from a trapper, but from an educated man, a neutral observer. Mr. Elias Thorne was a surveyor for the Union Pacific, a man of cold facts and figures. He arrived at the rendezvous in the fall, carrying a transit, a barometer, and a keen, observant eye. He was there to chart potential new routes, and he found the trappers' company a curious diversion. They held an impromptu shooting match for his benefit, a turkey shoot at a marked plank of wood 150 yards distant. Jed Franks went first. He fired 5 shots from a rest. Thorne, using his surveyor's telescope, observed the target. The 5 and 50 caliber holes were spread over a 12-inch area, a group the size of a dinner plate. "Good shooting for a buffalo gun," Jed said, satisfied. The other trappers posted similar results. Then Silas Vane stepped up. He didn't sit. He lay prone, deploying a small folding bipod he had made. He consulted his notebook, made a tiny adjustment to the screws on his scope, and took a deep breath. The rifle's report was a sharp crack, not the deep boom of the black powder guns. He fired 5 times, slowly, deliberately. Thorne focused his transit on the target. He was silent for a long moment. "Gentlemen," he said, "Mr. Vane has put all 5 of his shots into a space I could cover with a silver dollar." Jed Franks spat, claiming it was a fluke, that such a small bullet wouldn't stop a rabbit. But Thorne, a man of data, was fascinated. He spent the evening with Vane, looking at his charts, his reloading tools. Thorne's journal entry for that night read, "The trappers see a toy. I see a military revolution. Vane is not guessing at range. He is calculating it. He has applied the principles of trigonometry and physics to the act of killing. The implications are profound." Vane's crazy rifle was not a single invention, but a system of interlocking solutions. Each component was designed to solve a problem that the traditional rifles ignored. The first layer was the cartridge. The smokeless powder, known as nitrocellulose, was the key. It burned clean, so there was no fouling to freeze in the barrel. More importantly, it generated far higher pressures, pushing the bullet to a staggering 400 feet per second. This velocity was the core of the entire system. It created a flat trajectory. Jed's 50-90 bullet dropped 48 inches at 300 yards. Vane's .30 caliber bullet dropped only 14 inches. This meant that a slight error in range estimation, the bane of the frontier shooter, was no longer a guaranteed miss. The second layer was the bullet itself. It was long, pointed, and made of a hard lead-tin antimony alloy. This Spitzer shape, which Vane had copied from European artillery shells, made it vastly more aerodynamic. It cut through the air, retaining its velocity and energy far longer than Jed's round-nosed lead slug. It was less affected by crosswind, the very force that had defeated Jed's shot at the elk, and its hardness ensured deep penetration. It was, in short, a projectile designed for the air, while Jed's was designed for the gun. The final critical layer was the optic, the spyglass. Vane had sealed the lenses in their brass housing with a mixture of pine resin and beeswax, making the tube waterproof and nitrogen-purged by his own rudimentary process to be fog-proof. The 4-power magnification didn't just make the target look closer, it allowed for a level of precision that was superhuman. Vane was not aiming at an animal. He was aiming at the third rib of an animal. The crosshairs, made from fine spider silk, allowed him to hold on a single point, while Jed's thick iron blade covered half the target. The micro-adjustable mounts were his dope charts. He had spent weeks testing, firing at different ranges, in different temperatures, and recording the results. 10 mph wind from right, 200 yards. His book read, 2 clicks left, 10 degrees F, 300 yards, 3 clicks up. He was not a shooter, he was an operator. In January, the great blizzard of 1889 arrived. It was not a storm, it was a wall of white. For 3 days, the world vanished. The temperature, recorded on Elias Thorne's now abandoned barometer, plummeted to 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind, screaming down from the Canadian plains, hit 50 miles per hour, driving the effective temperature, the wind chill, to a life-ending 70 degrees. Jed Franks and 2 other men, caught checking their trap lines, were cut off. They fought their way back, snow-blind, their beards frozen solid. The rendezvous cabin was only a quarter-mile away, but it was invisible. They were disoriented, freezing and panicking. And then they heard it. It was not the wind. It was a deep, guttural huff. A grizzly. Massive, a 900-pound boar, its hibernation broken by the storm, was now starving and enraged. It had caught their scent. It stood between the three men and the cabin. Jed raised his sharps. His hands, wrapped in frozen mittens, were useless. He fumbled, dropping the mitten, his bare skin instantly searing with pain as it touched the 30-degree steel. He pulled the hammer back, his vision a blur of snow. The bear was a dark, shifting shape 300 yards away. He aimed high and fired. The boom was swallowed by the wind. He missed. The cloud of smoke from his black powder instantly caked his face and rifle in a layer of freezing white. The bear roared, a sound of fury, and charged. "Reload, Jed! For God's sake, reload!" one of the men screamed. But Jed's fingers were frozen clubs. He fumbled for a cartridge, his hand shaking violently. The bear, moving with terrifying speed, was at 250 yards. The cabin door flew open. Silas Vane. He wasn't wearing a coat. He braced himself against the doorframe, his rifle already at his shoulder. The world was a maelstrom of white. For Jed, the bear was a blur. For Vane, looking through his 4-power scope, it was perfectly clear. He saw the dark, matted fur, the driving legs. He had already done the math. The wind, the drop. His notebook was seared into his memory. He put the fine crosshair on the bear's spine, just above the massive churning shoulders, and squeezed the trigger. The sharp, clean crack was almost lost in the storm. For a terrible second, nothing happened. The bear kept coming. Jed screamed. Then its front legs buckled. It did not stumble. It collapsed, its spine severed. It pitched forward, ploughing a massive furrow in the snow for 20 yards before coming to a stop. A single, dark, unmoving mound. The Folly had fired one shot. The 3 trappers collapsed into the cabin, sobbing with relief and hypothermia. Silas Vane, his face calm, meticulously wiped the snow from his rifle, oiled the action with a thin graphite lubricant that would not freeze, and placed it back on its pegs. He then turned his attention to Jed Frank's hands, which were already turning a waxy, dead white. For the next 2 days the storm raged, trapping them all. They survived on the Grizzly's meat, which Vane and another man dragged back to the cabin. The mood was somber. Jed Franks, his hands bundled in rags, his trapping career likely over, sat by the fire, staring at Vane's rifle. The toy. The spyglass. He said nothing, but his silence was a confession. The era of the heavy thumper was over. When the blizzard finally broke, the world was a new, frozen white. Elias Thorne, the surveyor, was part of a small party from the railroad camp that rode out to check on the trappers. They found the men alive, and they found the carcass of the Grizzly. Thorne, ever the man of data, took out his measuring chain. He measured the distance from the cabin door to the bear. 294 yards, he announced, his voice filled with awe. He spent an hour with his knife, performing a field autopsy on the bear. He recovered Vane's 180-grain bullet. It had passed through the thick hide, shattered a vertebra, and severed the spinal cord. It was a perfect, surgically placed, impossible shot. Thorne's official report to the Union Pacific contained a detailed appendix, complete with sketches, not of the mountain passes, but of the Vane repeating rifle and telescopic sight. Word spread. Within 6 months, an ordnance officer from the U.S. Army, a young captain from the Springfield Armory, made the long journey to Wyoming. He came not to buy, but to observe. He watched Vane shoot at 500 yards, placing 10 shots into a 6-inch circle. The captain, whose own men were trained to fire in volleys at 200 yards, left a changed man. Jed Franks, his hands now scarred and stiff, pooled his remaining money and placed the first official order with Vane. "I don't care what it costs, Silas," he said, his voice quiet. "I just want to hit what I'm aiming at." Vane was no longer the clockmaker. He was the Wyoming gunsmith. You will not find Silas Vane's name in the standard histories of the American West. His cabin is gone. His forge is rust. But his legacy is written in steel in every rifle made since. The principles he proved in that blizzard of high velocity, sectional density, and optical precision became the very foundation of 20th century firearms. The military doctrine of the 4570 gave way to the 30-06, a cartridge that was a direct descendant of Vane's Wildcat. The telescopic sight, once a trapper's folly, became the standard for snipers, for hunters, and for every soldier who needed to be certain. Vane's triumph was not over the bear, or even the blizzard. It was a triumph of the mind, a victory of physics over assumption. He had proven in the most unforgiving laboratory on Earth that survival is not about the strength you possess, but about the intelligence you apply.